So the first presentation will be from the Baltic region, but a wider perspective as well, and will be shared between Professor Dr. Reinhold Hanel, who's the director of the Institute of Fisheries Ecology at the Tinen Institute, and has also done quite a lot of his own research on eel, and Jan-Dag Pohlmann, who's also at the Tinen Institute, but also chair of the ICES IFAC GFCM working group on eels. I don't know if I did that in the right order, but anyway, both of you, long-standing experience of work on eel, different aspects, and good overview. So I leave the floor to both of you. I think Reinhold is starting.
Yes, thank you very much, Nikki. I hope you can hear me well, and you also see my presentation. I want to thank the organizers for this workshop. I think it's a very timely workshop. There is a lot of discussion at the moment at various levels on the future of eel management. And therefore, since eel restocking is a widespread measure for the management of the European eel, I think it's worthwhile to talk about it and discuss the pros and cons of the restocking of eels. Well, but before I, let me see how I get this. Yeah, so before I get to the eel itself, I really wanted to make some general considerations about restocking. I think restocking is a very widespread measure for the management of fish. There is different reasons why people would consider to restock fish to natural habitats. And this has to do on the one hand with degraded wild stocks caused by habitat change, over-exploitation, but also the need to enhance fish yield where production is low. I think all these measures are valid, and they basically these ideas, the idea to restock out of these ideas is valid, and most of these ideas actually come initially, I think, from salmonid restocking or other freshwater fish restocking. Nowadays, I would say that even in salmonids, or especially in salmonids, many of these measures are also heavily criticized. But still, there is the need for restocking for these causes is seen by many people. So overall, there is always the question also about the motivation of stocking in a way. Why do you want to do that? And I think one issue, and the picture that we see here represents that very well. Everybody is happy restocking fish. So whoever restocked fish, brought fish from captivity to the wild, had some kind of a very positive feeling. I can assure you, I did that in my past, working in a hatchery, and one of the best things ever done was to restock fish, because you always have the feeling that you're doing something good. On the other hand, restocking often aims at increasing financial return. And this is something I think everybody has to agree. A lot of money is earned on restocking purposes. And very often, is it to increase stocks for commercial fishing, or is it also the production and also the sale of fish for restocking brings some financial return, which sometimes can be significant. But one important thing to consider is that stocking of natural habitats, of course, is usually a significant human interaction with an ecosystem. And I think this is also something, there is no doubt on this, that bringing in fish to a natural habitat, some of them were either artificially grown or at least artificially cultured or kept in captivity for some time, will have an effect on the habitat itself. So even FAO has kind of created some objectives of stocking, or has argued about some objectives of stocking. So you can do stocking for mitigation, especially of disturbances to the environment, mostly caused by human activities. So to compensate for these human activities, stocking is one measure of mitigation. Stocking can be for stock enhancement, especially to maintain the productivity of a water body. If, for example, fisheries is high, stocking can be used to increase the level of fisheries in some freshwater, also in marine habitats. This is done in some areas. Of course, also to compensate for recruitment overfishing. Stocking can also be done for restoration, to restore fish populations, to retain stocks of threatened species, or to create even new fisheries. So sometimes new fish species or already extinct fish species are stocked to create new stocks that are eventually also targets for fisheries. But, and this is, I think, more and more obvious from various scientific investigations, there is a lot of risks with relation or with regard to restocking. Of course, some are mentioned here. Stocking increases the risk for increased intra and interspecific competition between stocked and wild fish. Another very important issue that also has been picked up by ICES in several occasions was that restocking, especially of capture of captive reared fish, can lead to selection and genetic drift in captive versus wild populations. There is also more and more knowledge about genetic changes in captive reared fish, so epigenetic changes that distinguish stocked fish from wild fish. There is, of course, always a risk to biosecurity and the spread of diseases, parasites, and non-native species. I think Olga is later on speaking about that. Of course, there is also increased predation on aquatic biota by stocked fish sometimes, and a shift in prey abundance depending on the quantity of fish stocked into native rivers. But, and I think this is one of the foremost critiques, is that restocking can be a distraction from other management decisions to enhance indigenous stocks. So in some instances, fish stocking actually leads to fewer activities with relation to fishing effort reductions or to restoration of habitat, simply because restocking is a more simple and sometimes also a more cheap action. And there are also, of course, many more. So this is just from a very brief look into literature, relatively new literature, being very critical towards restocking, also, for example, in salmonid management, where I think the use of artificially reared fish for restocking to actually help the wild populations is heavily in debate. So how is it with the European eel? The European eel is, of course, unique in all this because of the very complex life cycle of the European eel, and also because of the fact that European eel is still relatively far from being artificially reared. So in comparison to salmonids and to most other fish species that are stocked, where the stocked individuals actually come from artificial reproduction, in eels, the stocked fish have to be captured as glass eels, mostly along the coast, sometimes even as yellow eels, and they are transferred and transported to other areas where they are basically stocked. So other than in other fish species, artificial rearing, artificial reproduction is not an issue. Juvenile eels have to be caught and taken from the wild to be transferred to other areas for restocking. So of course, the question is much more relevant even than in other fish stocks. Is restocking really a valuable measure to help the recovery of the European eel stock? And the rationale, of course, behind this restocking is that the eels must find in the recipient rivers where they are stocked, the conditions for the eels must be significantly better than in the areas where they are fished. And this is something which is scientifically heavily debated. Of course, the whole issue of restocking also drives the catch of glass eels as a source for restocking. One issue related to this is shown here, that of all these young eels that are captured every year, mostly for restocking, their fate is largely unknown. So just by maintaining this glass eel fishery, this also is one issue that the prerequisite that was brought up by the eel regulation, that at least 60% of these juvenile eels should be used for restocking. The latest numbers that were shown by the ICWG Eel Working Group show that almost 60% of these juvenile eels, their fate is unknown. So only a relatively small fraction of 12% was used for restocking in 2011. So what are the rationales that you hear all the time when it comes to restocking? I mean, we debated this very much in the past months, especially when the European Commission asked for the regions for more input towards a better protection of the European eel. A lot of discussions also were held on the rationales behind restocking. And some of the most important arguments I want to repeat here. The first one is that there is still a surplus of arriving glass eels in the donor areas that needs to be harvested. This is something that is brought up very often, but effectively there is no real scientific basis for this statement. In only a very few cases, people even tried to find out what could a surplus be for arriving glass eels in certain estuaries. And I think this will be mentioned later on in other presentations, that there is no real scientific basis for this statement. Another rationale or another statement being made very often is the glass eel catches for restocking purposes help avoid density-dependent mortalities in the donor areas. This goes into the same direction, and it basically says if you don't catch glass eels where they arrive in a certain quantity, then density-dependent processes will lead to higher mortalities there. Again, something that has never been scientifically proven. It would be very interesting to know what really happens if glass eel arrive at an area where the density is already high. Does that mean that they will be faced higher mortalities, or is it also possible that these glass eels will rather stay in estuarine environments or in saline environments? There are, for example, there are reports that even in saline environments, like in the German Bight, during high numbers of glass eel arrival, there was a standing stock of yellow eels that disappeared completely in the recent past. So it is more than unproven. It's really completely unknown if there are such density-dependent mortalities in the donor areas that would justify glass eel fisheries. Another thing very often heard, that restocking has overall a positive net effect for the European eel. And this is also something which is very much in debate. What you have to keep in mind is that at least the catch mortalities for glass eel catches is now at about 10%. Well, there are different literature citations on these. Older reports that probably are outdated now speak from about 40% mortality in glass eel catches. I think everybody hopes that this has been significantly reduced. Newer numbers talk about something between 7 and 10%. But you also have to keep in mind that there are transport mortalities and there are also mortalities during restocking. And this all means that this has to be compensated in these rivers where eels are restocked. So that means that the living conditions, the survival rates have to be at least 20% or even higher than in the donor rivers. Otherwise, the whole concept of restocking of eels wouldn't make any sense. Another issue that is very important, especially for the northern countries, that a lot of eels for restocking are actually on-grown before, and they are on-grown very often in commercial aquaculture. And this means that they spend quite a long time under rearing conditions in commercial aquaculture, with all the potentially negative effects that I wanted to point out before with regards to salmonids. So the only argument that remains basically is that restocking increases local stocks and helps, for example, in achieving biomass escapement targets like the 40% targets of the European eel regulation. And I think this is an argument that is valid. The more eels you drop into a river, the more eels will be in this river. This is very trivial, and it's clear. Being in that river does not necessarily mean that these eels will be able to make the way back to their spawning grounds as silver eels. So it just means the more eels you drop somewhere, the more eels will be there for some time. And based on this single scientifically proven argument, restocking is still a measure that is of high importance, for example, for the achievement of the European eel regulation. So, but what does the European eel regulation, and especially the 40% target, do with this in return? The problem is that being such an important measure in many countries for the achievement of the 40% escapement target, this means basically that by using restocking as a measure, this introduces a legal obligation almost for restocking in areas of low or absent natural recruitment. Meaning that to fulfill the 40% targets in areas where there is no or almost no recruitment, managers are actually forced to restock in these areas to fulfill their management target. Another issue is that this enforcement, this legal obligation also drives, at least in part, the high prices for glass eels on the market. And one issue about this is that most of these costs are actually covered by taxpayers via funding from EMF and MFAF. Another issue is that restocking is not limited to useful or to suitable rivers or freshwater bodies, but very often and to high quantities, juvenile eels are restocked upstream of hydropower plants and other unpassable river obstacles, which actually drives turbine mortality in these river stretches. And on the other hand, at last, these restocking purposes or these restocking actions actually sustain a completely artificial yellow and silver eel fishery in areas where there is almost no or very reduced natural recruitment. And I think this is really a critical thing, because restocking is very often sold as a measure for the recovery of the stock, but it actually sustains the fishery on eels, which in return again increases anthropogenic mortality significantly. So thanks for your attention. I stop here and give the word to Jan-Dag Pohlmann, who will for sure pick up some of these issues in a more detailed kind of way. Thank you very much.
Just going to come in here, Jan-Dag, while you're setting up, to say that we're a little bit behind schedule. We'll see how we can manage that further along. But welcome to provide your part of the presentation, Jan-Dag.
Yes. I assume you can see the presentation?
Yeah.
Then I will rush through it to save us some time.
Yeah, don't rush too much. We still want to hear what you're saying.
Yes, I will just show some of the data and the science that we have on glass eel fisheries and restocking. And obviously, the first question, sorry, yeah, now it works, is where's the stocking material coming from? And as you can see here, I'm sorry for the small labels. This is the landings in tons by country, and then the point here is really it's mostly coming from one country, and it won't be a surprise to most of you that this country is France, with about 50 tons of glassy landings in 2019, making up for more than 80% of all the glacial landings. Within France, it's mostly the Bay of Biscay where the landings are coming from. So this will be the focus when we're looking at donor water bodies. So the important question is there a surplus, or are there density-dependent mortalities, as we've heard before? And you've all seen this graph of recruitment before. It has dropped significantly, and the red line would be the one that represents the drop in recruitment. And the elsewhere series, and France is largely part of that one. And we are at about 7% recruitment. So it looks a lot like there's not much eel coming to France, so how can there be a surplus production? It is not that easy, however. There are studies. To cite one is ACU from 2011 in the Frémur catchment. They've looked at the eel densities and whether there is a density-dependent mortality or surplus production. And they actually concluded that this catchment is saturated. There is varying recruitment, but at a certain later stage, the number of eels remains rather constant. And there are some other facts, I won't go into detail here, that tell us that there's, with a high probability, there's some sort of saturation mechanism. However, the Frémur is a very small catchment in the northwest of France, and it's doubtable that these findings can be, well, the same findings will account for the larger river systems like the Loire or the Gironde, which are quite important in glacial fisheries. Another point that's made in this study is also, and we heard about avoiding other measures, that habitat restoration might circumvent the problem, because the system might be saturated because a lot of the habitat has been destroyed. And I'm not talking about barriers. It's mostly about growth habitats for young eels, especially in the upstream river sections. So there are indications, but it's not everything there is. If we're looking on a higher level at the whole of France, and we look at the landings of yellow eels, and also up here at, this is just after 2000, we don't have longer time series, but the abundance of yellow eels, this has been dropping and largely paralleling the drop in recruitment. And that doesn't exactly say there is a saturation with glass eels in these areas. So it's not black and white, but we are far from saying the catchments in France are all saturated with glass eels. That's the important point, I guess. Now, where are the eels stocked? This is more diverse than where they are caught, but as you can see, on-grown eels are almost exclusively stocked in one country, which is Germany, with 50 tons in 2019, but also Poland and Denmark. Glass eels are stocked in more countries, but again, Germany stocks the majority of glass eels, and then there's France, Sweden, Netherlands, etc. In a nutshell, eels are mostly being stocked in Central Europe and in the Baltic region. And in this region, and that's quite interesting, I think, we have quite active fisheries. These are the 7 countries with the most stocking, and these are the landings, fisheries landings in this area. And these 7 countries make up for roughly 60% of all the landings of yellow and silver eels that we have in Europe that were reported to ICES. So there is quite an active fishery. It's not just about fisheries. I would have liked to show the same graph for hydropower, but we don't have the data. What I can show you is sum A, which is the sum of anthropogenic mortalities, which also tells you more. You can have high landings because you have a large stock and a low fishing mortality, and the actual mortality is interesting. There's a threshold that's out there, 0.92. At 0.92, you would achieve 40% of the production that you would have without anthropogenic mortalities, also meaning 60% of the production are lost to mortalities. And not too many countries are above this threshold, but it is quite difficult to calculate, and it's quite complex, and these data are far from being comparable. The point is there are quite significant mortalities in the countries where eels are being stocked, but they are hard to quantify. If we're looking at a map of Europe, this is from the European Environment Agency. On the left-hand side, you see the impact of barriers, and whenever you see something pink or red, this is a significant pressure from barriers. I won't go into the definition, but as you can see, also in Central Europe, particularly in Germany, there's high pressures from barriers, and this is not to say you can't stock there by any means. This is just to give you an idea of how many barriers exist and how complex the issue is. And Central Europe and the Baltic region are probably not the ideal spot. And the same accounts for chemical pollution, an aspect that is often not mentioned. In the donor area here in France, we have a light blue, which means a better chemical condition of the water bodies. And again, in Central Europe and in Germany, the chemical status is not that good. So there's also some doubts whether it is a measure of recovery if we're transporting eels from good areas to not so good areas. Then we have obviously some other risks. We already heard it's wild-caught eels, so it's less, the stocking material is less controlled. It's a vector for pathogens that has been shown for herpes virus, that has been shown for Angelicola. So this is quite obvious. We've heard about the glacial fishing mortality. There's a regional adaptation of eels when they arrive. At least that has been shown. I know of one study from Cote on American eel, where they raised eels from glaciers from two different origins under similar conditions, and they showed differences in growth. So there might be other regional adaptations. And if we move an eel from one location to another, it might just not be adapted, or it might be performing better than natural recruits, and we don't really know what we're messing with. Same accounts for sex ratios, which is sex determination is density dependent in eels. So if we change densities, we also alter sex ratios potentially, and this might cause issues. We will hear a presentation on the migration potential of stocked eels, I guess, later, so I won't go into detail. The same on local ecosystem effects. I'm very keen on hearing these presentations, quite interesting. But there's a lot of risks involved in restocking. That's the bottom line. And this sort of had to lead to the current IC's advice, because in a nutshell, what we can say, we don't know if there's a net benefit of restocking. There's a good chance there is no net benefit. We don't have all the data on carrying capacity, mortality, and performance of stocked eels. And at the same time, there's risks involved that we do know of. And if you're following the precautionary approach, well, then you won't do something where you don't know if it's good, but you know there's probably something going on that might be a risk. And one very important point that's not really spelled out in the IC's advice, but it's there. Escapement doesn't equal spawning stock biomass. So even if fish are stocked in a local EMU and escapement is increased, we don't know if that actually will contribute to the spawning stock. If you stock an eel in the Baltic, the chances that it reaches the Sargasso Sea might be much smaller than the fish that escapes from France. So escapement is not spawning stock, and we don't know the effect of stocking on the actual reproductive potential of the stock. We don't know the spatial contributions of different areas to the spawning stock in the Sargasso Sea. And then following the precautionary approach, the idea is not to say, well, glacial fisheries and stocking is allowed and we shall see where it should be forbidden. The precautionary approach dictates, well, there shouldn't be any glacial fisheries and there shouldn't be any restocking according to this, unless, and that is also in the advice, there is a proven conservational purpose. So if there's proof that mortalities are lowered, and it's tricky for the reproductive potential, I have to admit, but if there's, let's say, a high probability that you reduce mortalities and that you add to the reproductive potential, the advice shouldn't apply. That's particularly stated. That's explicitly stated in the advice, and this is something that hasn't gotten that much attention, I guess. And yeah, I rushed through it. Hopefully, I haven't watched what time it is, but that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan-Dag.